Alright, and welcome. I'm Tim, and I'm here with my mate Jay.
Hi, love to be here.
And we're going to be talking about running up to the events of 192 AD and how Septimius Severus, one of my favourite emperors, came to power.
Now, I know absolutely nothing about this topic, and Tim knows pretty much everything there is to know about it. So we're just going to sit back and enjoy this ride.
Yeah, the intensity of the detail that I've explored this in is maddening, almost. Right. So to give you like a little bit of context, although it may sound like the dream of every historian to go back in time and live in the period that they studied, more or less any of them would tell you that in fact living now is by far the best time to be alive.
Yeah, definitely living now without, vapid disease running all over the place. The chance that you could just be murdered at any given point.
No one hairy is coming from across the sea to come and chop our head off and take our things. And that immediately puts us better than most other people in history.
We don't have to use the lavatory in the street.
Yeah.
That's very high on my list.
A paper cart can't kill us from infection.
Yeah,
we can understand infection as a concept.
If we get a cold, we can, take some medicine and then feel fine a few days later.
There's only kind of one point in history that historians, especially Edward Gibbon being the most famous one, refer to as a comparable time of peace, prosperity, and just general comfort. And that's the 2nd century AD, living within the internal provinces of the Roman Empire.
So that was essentially the best place to be in history other than modern times.
Arguably. I mean, unless you were a slave, a woman, not a Roman citizen, or anything like that. But for the people who were going to be taking this information from, they were having a sweet life.
Much like modern day.
Yeah.
All right, let's dive into this.
So the Romans state this area that was so fantastic to live in encompassed the entire Mediterranean Sea. And its borders ran along the Rhine and Danube rivers along the northern Europe. And on the other end of them, you got these confederations of barbarian tribes, which the Romans called the Germans, although they didn't refer to themselves as this. And their effect on the empire is the Romans were tremendously scared of these people, as they should be, giant, hairy barbarians with axes who come across without warning to take your things.
And they do not fear death.
And they do not fear death because, like we say, it's everywhere at this point in history. But these people weren't at any point threatening to the empire, or at this point certainly. The empire is a huge, completely interconnected and powerful animal.
So
They're not
it's essentially a superpower.
Yeah, it's a superpower without rival. And so these aren't existential threats. At most, they destabilize a small region or a small community of people are victimized by them.
So they're more of a nuisance,
They're a nuisance
rather than an actual threat.
Yeah, a few hundred dead people in Pannonia who've had all of their stuff nicked, and yeah, you're not going to get taxes or anything from those people anymore, but the entire empire is fine. Millions of people live in it, and most of them don't even know who these Germans are. The equal to Rome, regarding as a civilization, a centralized state, which had existed for hundreds of years, were the Parthians, who were the successors of the famous Persian Empire based in modern-day Iran. And rewind 200 years to when the Romans and Parthians first come into contact, they're equals. And in fact, the Romans attempt to invade Parthia twice in 100 years and are really embarrassingly kicked out. The first time they're kicked out by, it's Marcus Licinius Crassus who gets kicked out, the same fella that crucified Spartacus, and he's actually killed by the Parthians. It's really embarrassing when this happens for the Romans.
The poor Romans.
Yeah, but nowadays the Parthians, in the period we're talking about, the 2nd century AD, the Parthians just aren't capable of inflicting damage on the Romans anymore because they had something reminiscent of like the medieval feudal system. You know, that Game of Thronesy stuff where you have liege lords and they act independently, but they owe something to you. The trouble is when you have a weak king, or you have a king whose right to rule is disputed, these lords can just not do what they're told. And
so essentially they're fickle.
They're fickle and they have a lot of autonomy. And this is what's going on in the Parthian Empire at the time. It's rife with internal conflict. So it can't get itself together to get an army big enough to do any damage to the Romans. So the only thing that had ever posed an existential threat to Rome that could ever come in put their flag down on Roman territory and say we're staying, are no longer capable of that. They've aged.
So
and
Rome
they've
is
aged horribly.
without equal. At this
Rome is
point.
completely without equal. The only
They're living high. They're living the high life.
The only arguable world civilization to counter them at the time is the Han Chinese, and they're on the other side of Asia, so we don't have to worry about them.
Yeah, they're not making that trip
This is
anytime
a time
soon.
long before air flights or anything like that. This whole time is referred to as the Pax Romana, the Roman
The
peace.
Pax Romana.
And it's in 155 AD that the first protagonist of our story, who's both going to write the account that we get most of our information from and be an active participant in it, is born, Cassius Dio, to a senatorial family in Nicaea, which is in modern-day Turkey. And he is born to an incredibly privileged life, like an exceptionally.
So he's got it easy from the get-go.
He's in the top 0.1%.
Oh my word.
Yeah.
So he's really living like proper silver spoon.
Yeah, he doesn't become a senator by working his way up through he was destined to be a senator. His father was a
It's in
senator.
his blood.
Yeah.
It's in his Levi's.
And it means that he's incredibly well educated, having been able to afford the best education that there
Best
is.
schools. Best.
Tutors, everything.
Tutors,
Of course, it
everything.
wouldn't have been a public school. It would have been a private
Yeah,
tutor for
with
him.
the best
Yeah.
teachers.
Teach him oratory, teach him literature, everything like. But he does have a very aristocratic view of things because he is an aristocrat.
Did they teach him how to love?
No, sadly, love just isn't one of the subjects he talks about
God.
much. They mostly teach him to be sarcastic and a little bit independently minded.
Like most aristocrats, though.
Most aristocratic intellectuals, yeah. His colleague in telling us this story is a far more mysterious man who we know wasn't a senator. We know he was probably from a fairly privileged background, but not nearly Dio's level. And he's a Greek man called Herodian. And Herodian's background is far more mysterious because saying you were Greek in the Roman Empire didn't necessarily mean you were from Greece.
So was what was his name again?
Herodian.
So was Herodian a rival of Dio's?
No, we don't even know if they knew each other.
Oh, he's just another dude.
They could well have done, but this is the thing about Herodian. We know very little about him as a guy. Cassius Dio, we know about his life because he tells us about it, and because he's involved in the history. He's a high-up politician, an aristocrat. Yeah. Herodian doesn't. He might have been a minor civil servant, but he's not important enough to be mentioned by anyone else. So he's a far more minor guy, but he's definitely an intellectual, and he's writing for his fellow Greek friends who he himself visits Rome regularly. His fellow Greeks don't. Most people reckon he was from Syria, though. Because
that's a bit of a jump between Greece and Syria.
Well, Syria at the time was, or certainly Syria, the bit of Syria on the coast was largely culturally Greek.
Oh.
Like I said, most of
no idea.
the Eastern Mediterranean at this point is Greek. So saying you're Greek doesn't necessarily mean you're from Greece. You can be from Libya and Greek. South of Italy was referred to as Magna Graecia or Greater Greece because it was basically a part of Greece culturally.
It's kind of like saying how we just say we're from London.
Yeah, similar to that, although of course we're not.
We're definitely not from London.
And both of these men would be born roughly within the same time period. Herodian's probably a bit younger.
So these are two lads who have nothing to do with each other whatsoever. But
Born a few hundred miles apart.
They just happen to exist within the same cultural uprising.
And they're both going to write about the same story. Herodian just...
From two separate perspectives. Yeah. Oh, this is getting juicy.
Herodian being a man who lives in the empire, but wasn't there for most of it. And Cassius Dio as a man who was there for a lot of it. But because of that, kind of has a stake in things. These are people he knows personally he's talking about. So they're all... Dio, yeah.
Oh, yeah, so he has that, intimate... kind of sense into the story.
So he doesn't look at it objectively either. Some of these people are his friends and some of these people are his personal enemies. And he's not going to be talking about his personal enemies like they're good guys. And he's not going to let his friends, get a bad historical reputation by writing about them like they're dicks.
No, he's going to be a bro.
Yeah, he's going to be a proper bro. And both of these men would witness these later years of Rome's golden age, and they'd be depressingly self-aware of their own state's decline later on.
So they've seen the rise, and then
they lived during the peak of the rise,
and it can only go down from here. Is essentially what they're writing about.
That is
it's
essentially it.
Oh Lord, we've peaked.
Yeah,
we've actually hit peak performance, and we don't where can we go from here?
Yeah, no, this Roman peak performance is largely on account of this team of five. They're referred to as the five good emperors. and it starts...
The five boys. The
five
five
boys.
good boys.
Although realistically it's 4, but we throw the first one in Nerva as a kind of lifetime achievement award. He becomes emperor in his late 60s, and he builds a forum, but he essentially does nothing else. You can still see it in Rome, the forum of Nerva. It has a temple to Minerva.
I understand what like an online forum is, but I'm not quite...
Forum is
what's a real life forum?
The town centre. The town centre of Rome. And Rome had the Roman Forum, the original one, but because it grew so much as a city, as it became the centre of the Mediterranean world, every emperor made a new forum, and they tended to be bigger than the last, you know?
I feel really stupid for not knowing that.
Yeah, so in the same way that an online forum, a Roman forum was where people would meet in the day to conduct business, and it's where all of the public places were.
Yeah, where people just go to, like chat about their day and
Temples, the bars, and all of that. And the Romans led a very outdoor life.
They were sociable.
So he builds one of those, but essentially does not much else, and he's kind enough, and everyone's incredibly relieved when he dies. And
was he kind of just there like, you've done enough, you can...
He stabilised the empire, but most of all he declared as his heir... He declares as his heir a very flashy Spanish general called Trajan, and Trajan is everything that the Romans wanted in an emperor.
Is he their good boy?
Well, he was humble while still being an unstoppable super soldier, which is what they liked. They liked exceptional men who nonetheless didn't make a big deal of how incredible they were. And he essentially used the resources of the empire to conquer more of it and gain more. It's under him that the empire will be the biggest it ever will be. He conquers Mesopotamia. He fights the first ever successful war against these Parthian people, these Persians. He conquers Dacia, which is the area just north of the Danube, modern-day Hungary, Romania, area like that. Most of which is abandoned immediately after his death because he did push things just a little too far. He was simply too good of a soldier to not be beloved by everyone. And... as a little bit of a show of arrogance, but it was fairly normal in the Roman days, he builds a giant stick to himself in the middle of Rome.
So he's Rome's golden boy.
He's Rome's golden boy, and everyone knows it because there's a thing called Trajan's Column. It's right in the middle of Rome, and it's an enormous stick detailing his achievements in war.
We've been there.
We have.
Yeah.
And it's because of this huge stick that he's, interestingly enough, supposedly the only pagan to have ever made it into the Christian heaven, after a later pope sees a picture of him, which, by the way, he asked to be made. It's not a picture of him that someone else made as an act of kindness, where he's helping an old injured woman up. And the pope is so taken by this act of kindness that he prays for him to be allowed into heaven, even though he wasn't a Christian.
So he essentially faked this...
He could have helped up an old woman.
I mean, I'm not doubting whether he actually would have helped the old woman or not.
Before he helps the old woman up, taps his friend on the shoulder and says, "Film this. I want everyone online to know what a kind person I am."
Oh, so he's the kind of guy that goes out to homeless people and gives them like money and shit, but as long as their mate's filming.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Right.
Very comparable.
What a legend.
He leaves the empire to someone very different to him. He leaves it to his adopted... I forget how he was related to Trajan, but very, very tenuously.
Let us know in the comments if you know how he was related to Trajan.
Called Hadrian, famous for building a wall separating England and Scotland.
Oh shit, it's that boy Hadrian.
It's that boy Hadrian. Now, he didn't like soldiering, but he did love art. He brought the beard into fashion. Before that, Romans were all clean-shaven, short-haired. Hadrian wore his hair a bit longer and grew a nice big bushy beard.
A great big bushy beard.
A Greek big bushy beard.
He
loved all things Greek, and the Greeks loved their beards. He stamped out the last Jewish independent state in Judea and possibly caused the Jewish diaspora. And when he dies, he leaves the empire to the most boring man on the planet. And I cannot emphasize enough how one man can rule for over 20 years and still be this incredibly uninteresting.
How? How do you do nothing in 20 years?
The successor to Hadrian, a guy called Antoninus Pius, and it's during this reign that Cassius Dio, Herodian, and the other protagonist, Septimius Severus, are going to be born. During his reign, he literally just did nothing wrong. He's called a good emperor because of his ability to do nothing to screw things up. He saved up money, and he helped build the aqueducts of Rome to ensure everyone had clean drinking water. But again, all he essentially didn't do was cause a rebellion, start a war, start expensive building projects at someone's expense, or descend into paranoia and start murdering people. Which is fairly impressive, actually, as far as emperors go. A lot of them managed to do at least one of those things.
But he did them all.
He did none of them.
Oh.
Yeah, as in
What?
he neither started a war, a rebellion, an expensive building project, nor did he murder anyone out of being paranoid.
So he was just the most mild-mannered emperor
He was
around.
just a mild, all right guy. He never left the city of Rome either. He just governed everything from there.
Yeah,
and an
well.
attitude very much of figure it out for yourself, which at the time people did, because these were all competent men who'd been in their positions for a long time in a fairly uncorrupt system. So everything was essentially fine under him. And
Everything was just like going swimmingly, basically.
And he leaves the empire to a young philosophy student called Marcus Aurelius and his adopted brother Lucius
here we
Verus,
go.
but we'll forget about him. Marcus Aurelius is famous for being Joaquin Phoenix's dad in the Gladiator movie.
Ah, yeah. Ah.
So Marcus's reign features the first crises, as in a full-blown rebellion in the east, when the eastern provinces all decide they want someone else as emperor. It doesn't work, but nonetheless. One of the most devastating plagues in European history, often thought to be smallpox or measles. It's called the Antonine Plague, and it's awful. It absolutely culls all levels of Roman society. His own brother, or adopted brother, Lucius Verus, will die of it.
Damn.
And
So
it
this
kills-
plague just wiped out everything.
Yeah, one of the quotes, well, not everything, but enough of the population that it caused a serious stir. So about 2,000 people on average died a day in Rome.
Oh my
of it.
word.
Now, Rome is probably the worst place because it wasn't a clean city. It was incredibly crowded. So hygiene-wise, not a great place to live if there's disease rampant, but it still shows that every level of society was being hit by this. And this does an important thing. Those incredibly competent aristocrats like Cassius Dio, who are born and raised to run this thing, a lot of them die.
Oh.
And it leaves a lot of vacant positions for new people who perhaps aren't
They
as...
clearly don't know what they're doing.
aren't as maybe not incompetent, but not as uncorrupt, might be the way to put it.
Is this where a new wave of corruption kind of ran rampant throughout Rome?
Yeah, and Herodian, who is born just at the end of Antoninus Pius's reign and the beginning of Marcus Aurelius's, we think, refers to the era between Augustus, the first emperor, who'd reigned about 180 years beforehand, and this period as being the most peaceful in history, and says that as of Marcus's death, the great violence begins. He also says that Marcus
my
possessed
God.
every kind of virtue. So he was remembered by the Romans incredibly fondly. Even though his reign was endless war with the Germans in the north, this horrific plague, and incredible financial difficulty, he famously had to sell all of the furniture in his own palace to continue paying for his army. People still remember it with great fondness later on. People remember Marcus as being one of the best emperors, and later emperors will take the name Marcus Aurelius when they become emperor as a way of trying to associate themselves with this man that everyone thinks was just the best.
So he was the second Roman golden boy.
Yeah. Well, the
Marcus Aurelius.
The
you
third, if
son
you
of
count
a bitch.
Augustus, who is a real golden boy in the eyes of the Romans, and Julius Caesar. They loved him.
Yeah, Caesar's the goldest boy.
So men like Dio and Herodian lived these incredibly comfortable lives under these 5 good emperors. And
So
Dio,
did Dio and I keep forgetting his damn
Herodian.
name. Did Dio and Herodian, did they live throughout all of these 5 emperors?
No, they were born under Antoninus Pius, who is the 4th of the 5 emperors. Like I say, they're born in the middle of the peak.
Oh,
During
okay.
this 20 years when
And
nothing happened.
Do they kind of like predict?
They rather see it begin to go wrong.
Oh, okay.
Because this is written in hindsight for them. This is their older selves writing the story of their lives, or writing what happened during their lives. And it's during the reign of Marcus Aurelius when Dio starts his long and incredibly successful career as a politician. So he's one of these competent men that Marcus promotes. It would also be during this reign that a slightly older associate of his, who he'd come to know very well, and the other protagonist of our story, Septimius Severus, joins the Senate.
He sounds like a Harry Potter character.
It's funnily enough because Severus Snape is named after him, weirdly. And given that
Things you didn't know.
Snape was perhaps a good guy, if a bit unlikable, Severus is certainly an unlikable man later on in his life, if a fairly competent one. And he's one of this new wave of provincial
the new
fellows.
boys.
Yeah, no, he's a half Berber, so half native North African, and half Italian.
In Rome.
Yeah. But
Wow, what a combo.
What happened is Romans, in the same way that Trajan is described as Spanish, these are Roman provincial aristocratic families that owned land in these places and went out to live there. Through his mother's side of the family, he is aristocratic, blue-blooded Roman. But through his father's side, he is native African. So he's mixed race.
That's wild.
And his dad is a fairly successful businessman in Lepsis Magna, which is in a city in the north of Libya. And this is a real example of how good these years had been to the Romans. Lepsis Magna had an incredible irrigation system that it couldn't sustain by itself. It's similar to Las Vegas in America. It's a city in the middle of the desert, and it's more boasting, look how advanced we are, we can keep a city in the middle of the desert.
Big middle finger to everybody else.
More or less.
It's this hard because we can make it this hard.
How big and prosperous Lepsis Magna gets during Septimius Severus's life is a testament to how powerful the Romans are at this point in history.
God, the Septimius Severus, that's just such a fantastic name as well.
It rings so well.
Oh, that just exudes power.
He's not interested in his younger life in pursuing the same career as his dad, to be a merchant. And his father had made an awful lot of money off of the fact that this was a trade centre. He looked to his mother's side of the family, and his maternal cousins all had positions within the Roman Senate. And he tries to get in, but Marcus Aurelius doesn't really have time for this kind of upstart young provincial in his 20s to come in and be like, oh, I want to be involved in this. It's only when this Antonine Plague happens and loads die that the ranks are filled with these new young and ambitious men like Severus. Exactly.
New blood Severus.
By the time Severus's power starts really rising, it coincides with Rome running out of luck in regards to its good leaders. So one of the things that they're called the Antonines, the 5 good emperors, are praised for is their choices of heirs. So none of their successors, with perhaps the exception of Hadrian and Trajan, are relatives of theirs, because these men are largely childless, and none of them father sons who live till adulthood. So it's not like a usual monarchy where you leave it to your oldest son. These men don't have oldest sons. They just
present an heir and be like, I choose him.
What they did, they'd find a competent young man and they'd mentor him for a few years. And then when they died, this man who was younger than them would take over and do the same.
Yeah, sounds good.
This was considered an enlightened decision by them for a long time, although, of course, none of them had blood sons to pass the throne down to.
It does make sense. Choose somebody who, you've moulded after yourself. You've shown them the ways to be a good emperor, instead of just having someone who feels so entitled the throne is theirs that power may corrupt them.
And the obvious flaw of monarchy, of having one ruler which is hereditary, is you may have one good ruler and it's fantastic that he has all the power because he knows how to use it. But there's no guarantee that his son will be, or his grandson. Eventually you're going to get a bad egg. And the first one to have a blood son is going to be a bad egg. It's going to be Joaquin Phoenix. Commodus, even.
Not Commodus!
This is Marcus Aurelius's 19-year-old son when he dies, who takes the throne.
And he thinks he's shit hot.
And his reign is usually considered the beginning of the end of the Roman Empire. God. Certainly the end of this golden age.
We've gone over the peak.
Yeah. And at this time, Severus is in Syria, of all places, and he's there commanding a legion under the governor of Syria, who's one of Marcus Aurelius's closest friends and best commanders, a man called Pertinax. Pertinax now in his late 40s, 50s, and he's had a long and incredibly successful career fighting.
Just murdering his way through.
Well, that's the thing, is he's known as an incredibly good and fair man. He's a fantastic soldier. All of the soldiers who he commands love him, and this is going to be really important later.
So he has the heart of the army.
He has the heart. The soldiers adore him because they followed him, along with many other generals, in the Marcomannic Wars. Yeah. And now he's commanding them in the east. And Severus is one of his sub-commanders. The only thing is, Commodus is incredibly insecure, and we'll get into why in a minute. And this is basically because he's young, he's inexperienced, he's not very competent, and he's surrounded by all of his father's men. Men like Pertinax have been around a while, and he feels threatened by how good they are. So Pertinax
almost has little man syndrome.
He essentially has little man, or young man syndrome. Yeah. Young man in an old man's game. But, so Commodus fires Pertinax from his position, and Severus sadly goes with him, and this seems to be a bit of a setback. To give you some idea on the reign of Commodus, I can't go into it in detail, because as much as I'd love to, I could do hours on how dreadful he was. But I've made here a little short list of his various crimes against the state, individuals, and humanity in general.
Just an all-round awful guy.
One of the most hateable and contemptible men in history, really. It's fantastic. So he starts by killing his sister.
That's straight off the bat a pretty awful thing to do.
But not completely unusual, but when you add that to the fact that he allows his corrupt freedman and friend Cleander to amass enormous personal wealth and influence at the state's expense, kind of cronyism, he then subsequently betrays his friend and scapegoats him for a grain shortage, allowing a mob to rip him to pieces publicly.
Of course, what else would you do to your closest friend?
Believing without a hint of irony that he was the reincarnation of Hercules and dressing in a lion's skin and carrying a baseball bat around, or a wooden club rather, in an attempt to emulate his hero. He refounded Rome, a process that began after a fire happened, and he started rebuilding things. He renamed Rome Commodia after himself.
Did he start the fire?
It depends who you ask. He then renamed all 12 months of the year after himself. And I should point out, he did have 12 names. He didn't rename every month Commodus.
Okay, because that'd be pretty confusing. Hey, what's the?
No, it's the 2nd of Commodus. Yes, which Commodus?
Oh, the 6th Commodus is the second day of that. Ah, okay.
He also renamed the legions Commodus's Fortunate Legions. Yeah, no, his megalomania gets wild towards the end.
This man's... He's insatiable.
He likes to fight as a gladiator in the arena, which is, by the way, something considered incredibly vulgar to the Romans. I mean, someone, and I forget who, once compared it to if the Queen of England became a stripper.
Yeah.
You know, the kind of moral outrage.
I'm assuming that the gladiators would take the fall.
Oh, yeah, they were always pre-wounded opponents, sometimes amputees, or they were given blunt weapons, so they never stood a chance. He often also liked to hunt in the arena, so there were days when he'd kill like 200 ostriches with a bow and arrow. He was, to his credit, to be fair, famously an incredibly good shot. Yeah. But regardless, this didn't help his reputation any.
I mean, he's just slaughtering birds for fun.
He also liked to dress dwarves up and fight them so he could pretend he was a giant killing tiny mortals.
See, now that's hilarious but awful.
Yeah, like, it's one of those things where because it's
like if I was drunk and I saw that, I would be like, this is unbelievable. But
in the cold light of day, it seems almost morally wrong.
Yeah, when you take a step back, think about it, it goes, oh, that's actually awful. Yeah. That's actually a hideous thing to do to another person.
He also developed, especially towards the end of his reign, and this is part of the psychology that means he fires men like Pertinax, a paranoia so bad that he, instead of going to the barber or shaving, he would singe his hair with a little flame so that, you know, he would never have a blade near his neck or head. Which shows the kind of level of intense paranoia he was dealing with here.
This and it would lead absolute maniac.
It would lead to a reign of terror. Like the last year of his reign especially, everyone lives in constant paranoia that the emperor's going to think you're after them and just put you to death there and then.
Bloody hell.
That's an idea of how bad Commodus was. And it's during his reign that Septimius Severus, our main protagonist, tries desperately to move forward in his career, whilst also keeping his head down enough that Commodus doesn't notice him and kill him. So this guy, Septimius Severus, now with his career a bit stalled, spends the 180s instead trying to improve on his family life a little bit. Because, you know, he was tied to Pertinax politically, so when Pertinax is fired, he goes with him. And he welcomes a bit of time off to deal with some legal issues and deal with his life at home. So originally he marries a local Punic girl from his hometown.
Ooh, bit of local.
And no one knows if they had any kids, but by the 180s, neither she or any potential children that they had are still alive.
Oh.
And we know this because he's back on the single market now in his mid-40s.
Not prime age right there, is it?
And one of the important things about Severus is he's developed a love of astrology. The idea that the stars can tell him what he should do and what his destiny is. And he thinks that his destiny is to marry a woman who it's said is destined to marry a king. And she's a woman called Julia Domna, who's from an old clan of the city of Emesa in Syria. They're an old clan of kings who no longer really have any power. Most of them instead serve as high priests, but still a very aristocratic, blue-blooded woman of the Eastern tradition. And so he goes to her, finds her, and manages to convince her to marry him.
How has he done this?
That was fairly normal at the time.
I mean, what is this man's moves?
This man's moves being rich and powerful.
Yeah, that'll do it. That'll do it.
But
Continue.
despite the fact that now he's married a woman who it's prophesied will marry a king, for some reason this doesn't trigger Commodus's paranoia, and Severus, weirdly enough, isn't purged. In fact, he manages to get in with not Commodus's inner circle, but the inner circle of someone who knows someone who's in Commodus's inner circle. He's somewhat connected.
He's weaseled his way in.
He's weaseled his way back in, and he's managed to get himself the governorship of Pannonia. Now, Pannonia is where the majority of... It's one of the most militarized parts of the Roman Empire. It's got lots of soldiers in it. It's where most soldiers come from as well. And it's modern-day Austria, Hungary, that kind of area, that very western part of the Danube, just by the Alps. And it's because it's the frontier territory. Just across that are where these German marauders are, and it's where the border is weakest. Because up by the Rhine and Danube, you've got these enormous rivers they have to cross. Here is where the rivers are much thinner, and there are places where they can easily pass through. So this is where the raiders tend to come through. And it's where Septimius Severus is in charge of. And he's there with his old friends, the legions who once fought under Pertinax.
Yeah.
So these are people who remember Severus's old boss Pertinax fondly from fighting there, and quite like Severus now. So completely unsurprisingly, Commodus isn't going to survive long.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me in any way whatsoever. The man seems like an absolute goon.
Yeah, he's going to walk into a dagger one of these days. And it's often the case with rulers who execute thousands after seeing fake plots against their lives that real plots start to emerge. As Herodian puts it, quote, "At last it became imperative to check the madness of Commodus and free the Roman Empire from tyranny." Cassius Dio, who's in Rome at the time with Commodus, also talks about troubling portents such as a fire that burned down the Temple of Peace and large amounts of the palace, which he thought were the beginnings of clear signs at the beginnings of troubles. By the way, if you're getting the impression that the Romans were big on the idea of fate, signs from the gods, and predestiny, that's perfectly correct. They all are. They are all massive on that.
It does seem like they are following any kind of sign that they can like grasp meaning onto.
Or rather, anything that happens when they look back, they always see, oh, that it was a sign. There was a sign that this was going to happen.
There's clearly, this was predetermined.
And so what's it, as much as it may be in the Empire's good and in the good of everyone else to kill Commodus, the people who are actually going to kill him don't really have such high-minded principles to think about. They're thinking purely practically. And these are the kind of three heroes, not particularly likable heroes, who are going to free the Empire. To start with is the Emperor's mistress, Marcia, who's actually the wife of one of his servants, who Commodus early in his reign grows tired of his actual wife and exiles her, and instead takes into his bed this woman, Marcia.
Doesn't surprise me in any way whatsoever.
No, it's the exact kind of thing that he'd do. And she'd sneaked a quick peek at Commodus's list of names of people who needs to be killed. And she's on it, much to her shock. His growing paranoia has now led Commodus to start suspecting anyone close to him, including his mistress.
Well, I mean, she was plotting against him, so...
I mean, no, she's about to.
Oh, okay.
Because here's the thing, she might not have been before. Now that she knows she's going to be off in the next few weeks, it's a matter of life or death to get rid of this guy. But she thinks fast, so she looks at the list and sees two other individuals whose fate has been sealed and decides, let's get them on side. Two incredibly powerful men, the first of which is the Imperial Chamberlain, so like assistant to the Emperor, a guy called Eclectus, and the other one is arguably the most powerful man in the city other than the Emperor, and that's the head of his Praetorian Guard, a man called Letus. The Praetorian Guard are...
Is his name Deletus?
Nah, just Letus.
Oh, Letus.
Sadly not Deletus.
I thought the head guard's name was Deletus.
Well, he's about to Deletus Commodus from history. So.
Oh.
What's it? The reason he's so powerful is you're not allowed in the Roman Empire to have armed men within the city of Rome. It's illegal. It's a peaceful area. The Praetorian Guard are the only legally allowed to be armed men in the city. Okay. And then the Emperor's personal bodyguard as well. They guard him while he sleeps. And they're meant to be the most elite of the elite, although arguably they're not, and we're going to hear a lot more from them later. Okay. And Letus is their leader. However, they decided...
Can we call Letus Deletus?
I think for confusion we probably shouldn't.
Yeah, actually, yes.
But if it helps you remember, yeah, he's Deletus.
Yeah.
The one who Deletus'd Commodus.
Yeah, nice.
They decided, first of all, because it doesn't really set a good precedent, or it doesn't look good, to outright murder an emperor. That's no one.
you've got to be subtle about
No one
these
wants to be
things.
seen doing that. And also, whether or not, it'll most likely mean that they're sentenced to death by
Yeah.
the next emperor, regardless.
Can't have the emperor killers around.
Exactly.
That's not good for business.
Well, yeah, you don't want that. These people are capable of killing an emperor. If you are emperor, you don't want them to stay.
Definitely.
Anyways, so they decide to poison him. But the poison doesn't kill Commodus, only weakens him, makes him very, very ill, but he throws most of it up, because he vomits almost immediately. So the poison that he eats, most of it just ends up back in whatever bowl he threw it up to. He is, however, in a weakened state, and the conspirators now decide that because clearly their plot's going to be revealed when they find out that it's poison, it's time to just get rid of this guy by any means possible. And so it's New Year's Eve in the year 192 AD, when Letus let a wrestler called Narcissus into Commodus's bedroom, and he strangled the 31-year-old emperor to death there and then. And so that awful, awful Emperor Commodus is dead.
Nice.
Childless, having groomed no heirs, no younger man who... Because obviously he wasn't going to do that, because they'd be more likely to kill him if they knew a younger, more competent man was just waiting in the wings to come in and replace him. Letus, who seems to have been the most popular leader of the three, decided to choose the man that everyone loved. And to prevent a bloody civil war for succession, this was a good idea to get a new emperor as quickly as
A
possible.
new emperor that's liked by the people. He's young. He's hot.
Because when you hear that the position's vacant, anyone who can do it will probably throw their lot in. And when the winner comes out, those other guys aren't going to be happy that they came so close to the ultimate prize. And so who better that all the soldiers love, all the people love, and is old and experienced than that old retired man, Pertinax.
And I think we're going to bring it to a close there. I'd like to thank everyone very much for spending the time with us and listening to what we have to say. We'll catch you in the next one.
That's it. That covers the golden age of the Antonines, the disastrous reign of Commodus and his assassination. Next week we'll be back to talk about the reign of Pertinax.